disaster. David, a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's very nice to be with you. I'm so sorry that I am in my wife's study in the Upper West Side and not in Queens, but one day.
We absolutely look forward to welcoming you in person. Thank you so much for joining us. You speak about how you were brought up with the notion, if you can make a difference, you should. There are many ways that this could be applied. Why did you choose politics?
We'll start with the easy ones then. I think that question comes from a little book I wrote 2 or 3 years ago, and I talked a little bit about the fact that my parents were both. There you are. Thank you very much. Yes, available from all good bookshops. I wish. My parents were both refugees. My dad was a refugee from Belgium in 1940 to the UK. My mum spent the war in hiding in Poland and came as a 12-year-old in 1946 on her own. And it's interesting that for many immigrants and refugees, I think it's a common experience that parents want to protect their children from what they went through. And certainly I did not lead a childhood where my parents were drumming into me every day how lucky I was and talking to me about everything that they had been through. But I did have a sense that, I was born only 20 years after the end of the Holocaust. And so I'm part of what I call this transitional generation, which is old enough to have known people who survived the war, but young enough to outlive them and therefore have a responsibility to try to carry on, to tell the story and to tell their story and to try to learn some lessons. And so the notion that if you can make a difference, you should really came, I guess, from my mum and dad. They weren't into wasting time. They sort of thought that if you had time on your hands, you should use it. And they were very supportive of me, if somewhat horrified by the fact that all I was interested in until the age of 12 was football. And they worried I'd never learn to read other than the sports pages. But they did give me this sense that if you've got the chance to, and in a way, the security and the privileges of growing up in a middle-class household, you should really try and make a difference. And I think that I went into politics, first of all, as an advisor and as a policy advisor, and then as a frontline politician, as a front of house politician, for a very simple reason, really. It seemed to me the most direct way of making a difference. And that's why that phrase, if you can make a difference, you should. The simple answer is I thought that politics, despite the fact that Labour had lost 4 elections before I was 27 years old, or by the time I was 27 years old, it nonetheless struck me as the most direct way of trying to be part of a team of people trying to make a difference. So I think that's the reason. I have to also confess, I never sat down and thought, right, this is my quote unquote career. Yeah. It's sort of that there was a lot more serendipity than planning, I would say.
Well, you ended up handling policy for Tony Blair when you were only 32 years old. How did that come about? Can you describe the circumstances to us?
Well, we briefed, I think we probably briefed the newspapers that I was 32, but actually I was 29. So Tony became leader in tragic circumstances in 1994 when John Smith died. And someone said to him, hey, you should get this guy who's working for the Institute for Public Policy Research to run your domestic policy. John Eatwell was on the board of the IPPR at the time. And Tony, in a very Tony-ish way, sort of, instead of coming to me and flattering me with all sorts of reasons why I would be good for the job, he just said, well, I hear we're going to be spending a bit of time together, so I hope you've got some time on your hands, and we've got a job to do. And he asked me to oversee the overhaul of our party program, which had contributed to us losing 4 elections on the trot. And so I was in sort of bomb disposal mode to get rid of policies that were costing us votes, and in the policy creation mode of trying to put together the program that eventually became the 97 manifesto and that we put into practice. And I guess that my training for that was, I was in a very lucky position. John Smith created something called the Social Justice Commission in 1992, which was chaired by Gordon Borrie. And I was asked to be the secretary of the Social Justice Commission. The IPPR was hosting it. And that was really that was to reinvent the welfare state. And so I suppose the most proximate reason why I was asked to do that job was that I'd been involved in that policy rethink on the welfare front.
So on the topic of international affairs, you have commented on the decline of the liberal international order. Can you please explain what you mean by that and what you believe are the principal forces undermining the norms and institutions that define that order?
So the liberal international order is the term given to the post-1945 international settlement. Why was it liberal? Not because it was left-wing, but because for the first time in human history, individuals had rights as well as states having rights. Since 1648 and the Treaty of Westphalia, as you know, the rights of states were the foundation stone of the international system. After 1945, not in co-equal status, but in some status, individuals were given rights. So that's the reason that we talk about a liberal international order, that it gave rights to individuals as well as rights to states. It was international because every country in the world signed it when they signed up to it. When they joined the United Nations, they signed the UN Charter 1946, the associated conventions. So it was international in that whether you were communist or capitalist, whether you were a monarchy or a democracy, you were in. And it was an order because there were institutions created to broker compromises and to guard the global commons. And essentially, my argument is that, not an original argument at all, we're living in times that are less liberal, less international, and less ordered. And so that is the decline of what I would prefer to call the rules-based international order. Because what we're seeing is a devastating rise in impunity. Impunity, as you know, means actions without consequence. In the case of crimes, crimes without punishment. And the tip of the iceberg is what I see in my own work, which is that we have teams. The International Rescue Committee works to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict, persecution, and disaster. So we work in war zones, we help refugees, and we help resettlement of people who fled their home countries. And in Syria, our staff have been killed by Russian bombs aimed at staff driving ambulances. That is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to impunity. A war crime wasn't our clients, but 43 children killed by a Saudi missile in Yemen. That is a war crime. And the fact that there is no punishment for it is the ultimate definition of impunity. And when you begin to think about it, that tip of the iceberg, there's impunity further down the iceberg. There's impunity in foreign relations when countries invade each other or claim each other's land. There's impunity in the economy when companies evade taxes. There's impunity in politics, in domestic politics, because across the world, we're living in what the University of Gothenburg call the third age of autocratization. It's not a very nice word, autocratization, but Huntington wrote in the 1990s about the third wave of democracy, the fastest wave of growth of democratic governance. Today, we're living in a reaction against that in some ways, or certainly a third wave of autocratization, according to all of the indices. And so this notion that the international order is withering at international level, but also at domestic level, is, I think, very important. And just to avoid, I don't want to give a long lecture about it, but the one interesting point, people say, well, it's very idealistic to believe in an international order. No, the international order was built on a hyper-realist basis. I mean, the vision of the Atlantic Charter was quite realist, actually. It was signed in 1941 by Churchill and by Roosevelt, and then the creation of if you look back at how democratic nations, at least the contribution of nations like ours, to the building of an international order, the leaders then saw a rules-based international order as buttressing democracy at home. It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that democracy was being exported to the international level. It was that a rules-based international order would buttress democracy at home. And that it's waxed and waned, but what's striking over the last 15 years, really since 2005, is there's been a decline in respect for international rules by all sorts of measures, whether it be civilians killed in conflict or other measures. Just parenthesis, that's associated with a mushrooming of the number of refugees, which is what we spend part of our time in the IRC dealing with. But it's also been marked by a decline in the number of countries blessed with democratic governance at home. And that's why I think this is an especially serious moment. And I'm speaking to you from New York, as I said. The US has seen its own democracy wither, and its inability to defend the rules-based order internationally has also been a feature of this period.
Right. Well, and to your point, we can distinguish between impunity versus accountability.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. That accountability is the opposite of impunity. And where there is accountability, there is no impunity. And the whole notion of checks and balances provided by constitutions, checks and balances provided by free media, checks and balances provided by the independent judiciary, checks and balances provided by opposition political parties, checks and balances provided for by antitrust legislation. These are all examples of building accountability into systems. And there's a really brilliant book, which I discovered by accident, really, by John Kenneth Galbraith. He wrote this book in 1952 called American Capitalism, The Case for Countervailing Power. And I think that notion of countervailing power is exactly what my staff, our staff, they need countervailing power against war crimes. But that the case for building countervailing power is not just an international case, I would argue. Russian troops massing on the border of Ukraine, they need to fear the consequences of encroaching, or they will. But there's a need for countervailing power at home, because we have to defend our own democracies. I mean, I'm a visitor in the United States. I'm a British citizen, obviously, but you've got to worry when one of two main or only political parties in a democratic country has large numbers of people trafficking in the idea that democracy as practiced should not be defended in the traditional ways. It shouldn't be defended on the basis of making it easier for people to vote. It shouldn't be defended on the basis that results should be respected. I think that one of the impressive things about President Biden actually is that he's recognized the seriousness of the times. I mean, it's not quite après-moi le déluge, but his responsibility to make democratic government work, democratic with a small d, not a large d, is a very, very heavy responsibility, because I think the costs of failure on his part will go way beyond the US.
So, I was going to leave this for a little bit later, but it's a good time to discuss this now. What do you think the greatest challenge of the Biden administration is, in your opinion, in the context of what you just discussed, but also in unifying the US? Can this be achieved?
Well, I first came to America in 1977 as a 12-year-old schoolboy, because my dad got a job here for a year. And the notion of from many into one felt strong. I mean, it felt like a country with 3 time zones, but a single country. I came back as a graduate student in the late 80s and came back here to work after 2013. And it doesn't feel like a single country anymore. I mean, it's partly the difference between being 12 years old and being 55 years old, but 56 this year.
Me too.
Going too fast. But so it doesn't. I don't know about unifying the country. I mean, the country's balkanized, and I use that phrase advisedly, but also knowing what it means. I mean, balkanization was the process by which neighboring groups of people came to hate each other, and that is in what became and then is now formerly Yugoslavia. And the sense that there are different facts, different cultures, different communications, different media centers, different ways of thinking. Soon you'll have different schooling systems, and you'll really be in a very, very divided situation. I don't know whether he can, quote unquote, unify America. I think he has said his biggest task is to show that democratic government, is a better way of putting it, can work. And I think that's right, because in all sorts of ways, democratic government has been failing in America. I mean, they've not passed an immigration act since 1986. Their infrastructure is horrible, and the strains of federalism are massively outweighing the benefits of it at the moment. And that would be the case just because of the domestic situation. But in the light of a changing geopolitical context where China is presenting an alternative political system. I'm not one of these people who believes that they're trying to export it in an aggressive way like the former Soviet Union, but nonetheless, a political system based on unfree politics and relatively free economics is a new political formulation on the global stage that I think is really important to take seriously. And so I do think there are all sorts of policy issues that President Biden and his administration have to take on, but the fundamental one is to show that democratic government can deliver and can bridge what seems to be a democratic deficit when it comes to delivery. And my God, he and his team have got the work cut out for them.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. He does have his hands full. You know, he was just a few minutes ago on national television announcing the withdrawal of the US troops from Afghanistan. Now on September 11th, which is, as we all know, the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks on the US that prompted the very invasion of Afghanistan. And the US has spent $1 trillion on this. So what do you think the Taliban will do next? And what does this all mean for the people of Afghanistan?
Well, there's a terrible old cliche, which is that the Americans have watches and the Taliban have time. And so what the Taliban, I think, will do is wait. And they'll wait until, I think he said he's going to withdraw by September 11th. First of all, this is obviously a private discussion, but these days nothing's private. So I will choose my words carefully, because we've got a team of 1,160 people on the ground in 9 provinces in Afghanistan. 6 of them are non-Afghans. So there are incredible Afghan men and women who are working as finance officers, as doctors, as nurses, as educators, as child protection officers, right across as economic livelihoods support, agricultural livelihoods we support in Afghanistan, all across the country. And so I'm very conditioned by what their perspective is, and obviously they fear regression on what they've got. They fear loss of what they've got, which in many ways is not much, because it's one of the poorest countries in the world still. And they fear not just loss of what they've got, but a recrudescence of the levels of violence that they knew after the 2 or 3 years after the Soviets withdrew in 1989. And the decision that President Biden had is obviously a difficult one. Essentially the choice is between troops who stay basically forever, underpinning the Afghan state, in the interests not just of Afghans, it's important to say, but in the interests of American counterterrorism interests and American regional interests, which are not to be sneezed at. And of course, America's basically had troops in Korea forever. It's basically had troops in Germany forever. So it's not so outre to think that that is an option, versus the decision that he's made. And it's a very hard choice, because people think it's a choice between the popular thing and the not popular thing. That's wrong, actually, because in other words, it's popular to leave and it would be unpopular to stay. It's popular to announce you're leaving. It's not popular 6 months or a year or 2 years after you leave to say that you've got to go back.
Right.
And this administration are full of incredibly smart people who realize that there is a non-zero chance of that being the case. They've thought it through in a very careful way. And obviously the great fear of those of us, I went to Afghanistan 6 times in my period as Secretary of State, as Foreign Secretary. And the great fear is that we'll move from the militarization of diplomacy, which has been the bedeviling sin of the last 20 years, really. The $1 trillion you spent, I think 84% of the current American spending, but a very high proportion of total American spending has been on military.
Right.
And actually Europeans, the figures are more or less inverted in terms of civilian versus military support. But the hole in the middle of the strategy has been a diplomatic, political strategy. I went to Afghanistan for the first time in July. Sorry if this is too long an answer. So
no, not at all.
I went to Afghanistan for the first time in July 2007. It was the first place I went to outside. Well, no, I've been to anyway. I went in July 2007, and as it happens, I was there when the last king of Afghanistan, Zahir Shah, died. He died in exile, actually. But he came back to be buried, and I was there on the day of the funeral. And I will never forget walking in this funeral procession, and all of Afghanistan was there. I mean, it's a country of 40,000 valleys and villages, and representatives were there in all their diversity.
Right.
And you had a sense that this was the opportunity for an inclusive political process, which of course the Bonn process wasn't in 2001, too. And the great tragedy today is that sense of national unity is nowhere to be seen, and that that the country is going to, and its people will fall prey to internal and external interests. So it's a long-winded way of saying he had a very difficult choice. If people are interested in more or less where I come out, I was on something called the Afghan Study Group, which was published by the US Institute of Peace earlier this year, and that gives you some hint as to where I would have come out on the choice.
But David, you've often said that there will be no Afghan settlement without a regional settlement.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my argument, I worked with Sherrod Cooper-Coles, who was our ambassador at the time. We were the first, I don't know, sort of trumpet, it's not nice to hear people trumpeting themselves, but I'll give the credit to Sherrod. We were the first people to argue for the shape of a political settlement that was national and regional at the same time. And I still believe that that's essential. And to be fair, there were signs of Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, trying to push that 6 weeks ago, but it doesn't look like there'll be time now because no one feels people will just be waiting for Americans to leave.
Well, and you've also said diplomacy doesn't work if there's no leverage.
Well, George III, Frederick the Great said, diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. So I'm afraid that's the leverage point.
Yeah. So we all watch in horror the devastating situation at the US southern border. What are your thoughts on this, and what should people in the US and the Biden administration be doing at this very moment? It's a very complicated situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think given that a lot of your audience are European, the way I would put it is that in very crude terms, Europe and America face the same question, which is being asked by people on the move from sub-Saharan Africa and then North Africa coming into Europe, and then the southern border into the US. They're fleeing countries that are riven by conflict. So there's a failure of diplomacy and state building and nation building at the root of this, but there's no short-term answer for that. There's a mix of people who are fleeing for their lives and people who are fleeing for a better life. So it's a mixture of refugees and migrants. There are a series of fragile states on the way from sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa to Europe, and then fragile states from the northern triangle of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras on the way to the southern border. Then there are borders that are patrolled but never inviolable. No matter how high you build the wall, you'll always find people willing to find their way around it or under it or over it, and people charging desperate people to make the most of it. And then inside the US and to some extent inside Europe, you've got inadequate facilities for processing asylum claims. I'm a great believer that an efficient system for processing asylum claims is essential. Otherwise, you can't decide who should be allowed to stay and who shouldn't. And so there are very few good options, but I think it is possible to say that there are humane, efficient, and fair options. And those are circumscribed by the UN treaties, but they depend on real investment. And I would call out what Mrs. Merkel did. She processed 1.5 million asylum claims in 2015-16 and showed what could be done. And now 2/3 of the people who qualified are now speaking German, and half of the adults are in work. And you've got a dynamic there that is not the disaster that people predicted. I mean, we've got teams working on the southern border and in our offices in Phoenix and El Paso and San Diego, running shelters for people who come through. And at the moment, just one statistic for you, you said it's horrifying. If you apply for asylum in America, your case probably won't be heard until 2024 or 2025. And as long as that's the case, you're never going to get the system to work. And that's one of the fundamental things they've got to get right. I think you're on mute, Anna.
I'm sorry. There we go. That's better. Sorry about that. Well, and just a last comment. How are they going to handle the children, the unaccompanied children?
Well, I think they're going to try and get them out of detention as quickly as possible and into foster families or to relatives. And I mean, that's what they need to do.
Yeah. It's just such a huge infrastructure at the moment. It's really amazing. How, in your opinion, is the British government going to tackle a post-Brexit Britain?
Well, we're never post-Brexit. We're always in Brexit. So sadly, there is no post-Brexit is like post-COVID. It's going to be sort of more in the imagination than the reality. Look, we're going to be negotiating Brexit for the next decade, economically, socially, culturally, politically, and we're going to be living with it. I mean, I don't know whether you're meaning how are they going to live with it economically or politically. I mean, let me just deal with the politics because
or both, yeah, both.
Or both. I mean, one of the things that makes me saddest is that Britain now has a foreign policy that pretends that the European Union doesn't exist, which I think is it's not a tenable basis for the future of international relations, not least when international relations includes things like the environment, where the European Union is a genuine superpower. The climate change, the climate issue. Right. So there's a question of how will the British government negotiate or live in a post-Brexit or a Brexit world, and how should it? I mean, I think it will do so by trying to ignore the European Union to some cost. And I look at what's happening in Northern Ireland with real trepidation at the moment. But it's the natural consequence, I'm afraid, of the type of Brexit that's been pursued. Now, on the foreign policy front, I think there is room. I mean, there are 15 European global missions. They're all in British interests. We should be working with the European Union, not separate from them. On the economic front, I mean, you and other people on the call will know more than I do, but I mean, it's obvious that we've put a drag anchor on around ourselves, and we're going to have to work twice as hard and twice as smart to pull our way through. I'm not one of these people who thinks the British future is bleak. I think it's an amazing country. It's a great country. But you know from the university sector, we've made life very difficult for ourselves with the type of Brexit that's been voted through. I mean, obviously, I was against Brexit itself, but it didn't need to be as bad as this, I would argue. And I'm afraid some of the costs are being hidden by the nature of the COVID crisis, but they've not gone away. And so the structural challenges for Britain are very real. And of course, the country's got amazing people and amazing strength and some amazing institutions that can help overcome them. But it needs, one of the things I would say is that you need to be realistic about where power really lies in the world. And there's Chinese power, there's American power, and there's some European power. And the idea that we're going to put ourselves in there as Britain as an alternative regulator to the Americans and the Europeans, or Britain as an alternative political node or hub, I think is straining credulity. What we could be is a defender and a connector. We could be a defender of a rules-based international system as long as we obey the rules at home. And we could be a connector of the global system because of the assets that we've got to play. But this needs talking about, because Brexit isn't done, and it's going to be forged over the next decade.
Yeah, it's going to be a very long journey. David, we could be speaking to you here for hours. There's a lot of Q&A, and right. I just ask you one very last question. In your book, Rescue, you discuss that it is easy to feel that the issues we've been discussing are too large, too complex, and have gone too far to make a difference. How and what can we all do to help?
Well, I think that always remember that I quote this, that this film crew went to Democratic Republic of Congo and they said, if you look at the statistics, you get depressed, and if you look at the people, you have hope. And if you're running an NGO, you don't have the benefits of a bird's eye view that you get in government, but you do have the benefits of starting with the people and then thinking out from there. And so if you want to make a difference, I would say, one, use your voice, because we're all citizens. We're lucky enough to be citizens, and we live in countries where you can use your voice. Two, use or enable or use the institutions you're part of to make a difference. So what scheme does Queen's have for refugees to be admitted? What opportunities are there for other institutions that are represented on this call for refugees to be employed or to make a difference or to be engaged? Thirdly, I think that those of you in the academic arena, make your work, those of you, relevant to these issues, because they are waiting for someone to make their name from academia as someone who's really thought it through. And so around the economics of, if you think about hosting of refugees as a global public good, which is mainly done by poor countries, there's a big room for economic innovation in that area. Innovative finance hasn't reached the humanitarian sector yet. I hope some of your students want to work in the NGO sector, in the humanitarian sector. And obviously, I'm British, so I don't like, I'm not good at, I'm not a natural fundraiser, but having lived in New York for 7 years, I also say you should all visit the IRC website, which is www.rescue.org, and make a very large donation. So because the money goes a long way.
David, thank you so much. The audience Q&A will follow now for about 30 minutes, facilitated by Juliet Davis and from Queen's, and I will finish off in a few minutes with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Hello, Juliet.
Hi, thank you both for such an interesting discussion. So we're going to start with a few pre-submitted questions that we've had from the MCR members. So the first is from Sebastian Berger. In your role as Foreign Secretary, were there moments when you were scared that your decision or the decision of the government as an entity could affect the life of very many people, potentially millions, or to the worse? In a nutshell, did you have nightmares about such scenarios?
Not nightmares, no. And we were never in a sort of Cuban Missiles Crisis style conflict. But in a way, when you've got situations involving an individual, it's almost worse. So when you've got a hostage crisis or a similar thing, and the decisions that we had to take about Afghanistan, about how to pull out of Iraq, which was very badly wrong by the time I came into office, then obviously you feel a sense of responsibility. I'll never forget, I went to Sri Lanka as the civil wars ended, and the then government, in an early example of impunity, was bombing civilians in the Jaffna Peninsula. And we went to a internal displacement camp, and there were women waving these pieces of paper at me saying, here's the name of my husband or my son who's been taken away by the authorities, and I don't think I'll ever see him again. I need you. I was there with Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister at the time. The women said, you are the people who are going to have to find our husbands or our sons for us. And so I don't want to seem heroic or dramatic about it, but I think there's an enormous privilege in representing your country, but you also feel a strong sense of responsibility when you're doing that. And I think when you're in politics, you do have the bird's eye view, and the danger is that you lose sight of the people. And that's one of the things I tried to do throughout my 3 years in the Foreign Office, was not lose sight of the people. I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. So we have another pre-submitted question. This one is about your time as an MP in South Shields. So this is from Rob Bates. He says, I am from the Newcastle upon Tyne, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the regional inequality in the United Kingdom, especially the growing divide between the North and the South. According to the State of the North report published by the Institute of Public Policy Research in 2019, the UK is a, quote, more regionally divided than any comparable advanced economy. Given your own experiences representing South Shields in Parliament, what is what do you think about the attitude of the state of affairs and what might be done to correct it? Is there any likelihood that policymakers will attempt to develop enormous potential of regions such as the Northeast?
Well, it's a really good question. And by irony, I mean, Anna was asking me earlier about the 11th of September 2001. On that day, I was giving a lecture or a speech at Newcastle University about regional inequality and what to do about it. And it was only I went to the BBC to do an interview for the 1 o'clock news, and it was only coming back from that interview that the taxi driver said, "Hey, have you heard about what's happened in New York?" And that was when the first plane had hit. So it's not a new issue, obviously. And we still have links. We still have a house in South Shields, and we still go. I mean, one of the painful things of this year is we've not been able to go back. A couple of things. First of all, Rob referred to North-South, and then he referred to regional division. There are divisions within regions as well as divisions between regions. I think it's important to say. And sometimes the 7 miles from Newcastle to South Shields can seem like 7 miles, and sometimes it can seem like 70 miles. Tragically, there are some children in South Shields who don't ever go to Newcastle. So those divides within regions can be very important. My own view for point one. Point two, I'm not one of these people who thinks that the North will get better by doing down the South. I mean, it's not going to help the North if London is poorer. I don't think that's a very good argument, but it's not sufficient to say that wealth will trickle up from London to South Shields. And there needs to be systematic thought about how to ensure that a place like South Shields isn't just a great place to live, which it is, but can also be within striking distance of a great work to do. And that's the economic challenge alongside the social challenge, because obviously, just to take that constituency as an example, it's an ex-mining, ex-shipbuilding constituency. So it's now there are examples around the world of places that have renewed themselves and reinvented themselves. The challenge for the UK, obviously, is that if you think about America, finance is in New York, politics is in Washington, film is in Hollywood, medical science is in Pittsburgh. You've got quite a spread. Now I know we're speaking to Cambridge, so Cambridge is the centre of the universe as far as you're all concerned. But the concentration of all of those facets in and around London is a striking part of the British economic geography, and is in contrast to the 19th century, actually, which had a dispersed set of economic assets in a way. And I don't want to pretend it's easy, but I do still hold to some very basic ideas that if you're not connected, you can't be part of the game. And the connection is not just transport, it's obviously digital as well. That if you're not educated, you're not going to be part of the game. And so there's a massive education and aspiration set of issues around this. Thirdly, if you're not incentivized, you're not part of the game. And so I would like, the government has allegedly said it's committed to quote unquote leveling up. And so I'd like to see a debate about what that means, and not just for individuals, but for communities, and to hold the government to account, because I think that's where we need a debate of ideas. And I think Rob quoted the Institute for Public Policy Research, who I used to work for. It's going to be organizations like that that are developing bold ideas that don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, they can learn from other parts of the world about what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, really interesting. So the next question came in from the YouTube. So would a Marshall Plan type of investment in a Central and South American countries, such as Ecuador or Guatemala, be a solution to the immigration problem on the US southern border?
Yeah, interesting. So I'm sure there's someone on the call who has written a PhD thesis on the Marshall Plan, but just for those who haven't, I mean, the Marshall Plan was the plan announced by George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, in 1948 in his Harvard commencement address for the rebuilding of Europe. And what people forget is that it was not just rebuilding Europe with a public effort, it was rebuilding Europe with a private sector as well, and rebuilding Europe culturally, because cultural links were a big part of the Marshall Plan too. So should there be a quote unquote Marshall Plan for, you could say Central America, you could say parts of the Middle East as well, actually. I mean, the short answer is, if you want to, is that if you want to manage migration, but more important, if you want to build decent societies, there needs to be a global effort to ensure that those who are left behind get a chance to get on their feet. 64 countries in the world before COVID were paying more in interest payments than they were on healthcare before the COVID crisis started. So talk about having a drag anchor around you. Now, I think it's also important to say, Juliet, that it's tempting for someone like me to say, oh, if you get economic development, you won't have any forced migration. It's not true. As it happens, the econometric studies show that up to $7,000 per year per person income, countries still export people. That there's even if your income when your income goes up from $3,000 per person per year to $5,000, you've got more people leaving than coming in. So it's not an easy. There's no easy trick to development, meaning an end to migration. That's why I don't want to instrumentalize humanitarian aid. I think it's important that we should be committed to the world's poor because they're poor, not because they might migrate. Now, I also would say that there's something very, very interesting. I hope someone is interested in studying this and working on it. The geography of poverty around the world is changing in the most amazing way. There are more extreme poor in Nigeria today than in India, even though Nigeria has 1/8 the population of India. Why? Above all, because significant parts of Nigeria, it's not because there aren't rich people in Nigeria. There are plenty of rich people in Nigeria. The reason is, I have a feeling the Gini coefficient is more or less the same in Nigeria as it is in India. The difference is that parts of Nigeria are war-torn, and that is symptomatic of the way poverty, extreme poverty, is now concentrated. 46% of the world's extreme poor are concentrated in conflict and in fragile and conflict states. And that's the changing geography of poverty. If you're born poor in a stable country, there's a decent chance the market economy will help bring you up. If you're born poor in Yemen or in northeast Nigeria or in Afghanistan, your chances are really very, very low indeed. And that's where I think we've got some really serious work to do about the sequencing of diplomacy, politics, economics, peace building, because unless you get those right, there won't be any economic development.
Right, yeah, very interesting. So the next question is from Alice. It says, what has it been like for you as a British national watching the UK from the outside with the ups and downs of the government decisions surrounding the current pandemic?
Painful, I would say. Just about the pandemic, or in general. I thought about British politics. I mean, look, the vaccine, the vaccination has been a triumph. I mean, it's ironic that it took my old boss Tony Blair to tell them to do the get the first jabs done and, if necessary, postpone the second one. But the vaccination has been great. The rest of it, talking to my friends and relatives and former colleagues, Britain was ranked top of the Johns Hopkins League for pandemic preparedness before COVID. And yet today we've got more or less the highest number of deaths per head, and all the. So it's the vaccination has brought pride in what the NHS can do, and but the rest of it has brought a lot of pain. And honestly, I looked at some of the pictures this morning from yesterday, and I have to say I worried. I mean, I don't want to seem like a curmudgeon, but honestly, be careful. I mean, most under 30s have not had a jab in the UK yet. My kids have been going to school, but they wear a mask. I cannot understand how mask wearing is seen as kind of a choice almost, it seems, in large parts of the UK. I'd really plead with people to be extremely careful. I've had one shot, and so I'm going to, in 2 weeks' time, I'll have another one. And so, there's been some of the best of British, and there's been some of them not the best as well. Yeah,
okay. Agree. So our next question is maybe slightly lighter. This is from Carrion. Your career has been so varied, allowing you many different experiences. What is your proudest moment achievement in your career so far?
Well, I hope it hasn't happened yet, my proudest moment, but I think I'm really proud when in June 2006, I was appointed Secretary of State for the Environment, and Tony Blair said to me, look, you've got to get this climate issue back as something where the government's on the front foot. And we came up with the idea of a Climate Change Act, which would bind all future parliaments. No government in the world had ever, no parliament in the world had ever done a 40, 50-year legal requirement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And over the summer, we wrote up a climate change bill in the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. We then sold it to the rest of the government, really thanks because Tony backed us. The Tories then felt they had to back it as well, and we created something called the Climate Change Committee, which was modeled on the Monetary Policy Committee, to measure 5-year budgets for greenhouse gas emissions and make recommendations that the government was required to follow. And I then got shuffled out of there actually in June 2007 to become Foreign Secretary, but the bill became an act and the act became law and it's still there. And so I think I really feel a sense of being present at the creation. And I can honestly remember I sat with my one of our civil servants, Ravi Gurumurthy, who's now the head of Nestor, and we sat there in DEFRA in June or July, and we said, well, what the hell are we going to do to grab back the initiative on climate? And we batted around and we engaged people and we brainstormed and we came up with this idea of a long-term carbon reduction or greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan. And it speaks to the tenor of the times that it got all party support and it hasn't really been undermined. I mean, it's not always been hit, but I think that's really, really tremendous. And so in large scale, I think things like that. In small scale, when I was schools minister, we all of the capital investment programs were incredibly fragmented. And so they weren't doing that much good for the schools, and there was no political credit for them either. And we created something called the Building Schools for the Future program, which said, we're going to rebuild or refurbish every secondary school in Britain, in England and Wales, sorry. And my God, we went about it. Now, unfortunately, the coalition government that came in 2010 cancelled it. But we did get through 5 waves of the Building Schools for the Future program. And Charles Clarke was Secretary of State for Education. And I still have people come up to me saying, hey, that Building Schools for the Future program, that made a difference to our school. So that was that makes me feel good.
Well, David, I'll just butt in here because in addition, London under your tenure became the best education region from the worst one under your leadership.
Yes, but remember, there are loads of people on this call who are not from London, so you've got to be careful about that.
Take the compliment.
Thank you.
Wow, that's really great that you've got so many things to look back on and be proud of. So our next question is, what is your one piece of advice to someone considering pursuing a career in a non-government organisation?
Do it. What is good advice. I mean, if they want a career in an NGO, then I always say to people, follow your passion. And if they've got a passion, if they think that's the way they can make a difference, great. I think the one piece of advice I give to every intern and every new employee in the International Rescue Committee is, if you've got a question, ask it. I mean, it's a good test of any culture. Are people scared to ask a question, or are they confident that they're not going to be laughed at? So find the right time, but ask a question. I think that's a really good test of an open culture. I try and role model that myself. If I say in a meeting, well, what does that mean? People look at me and say, well, you should know that. And I say, yeah, but do you want me to hide that I don't know it? Yeah. So that's important. And I think that, look, the truth is the future is going to be built probably by tri-sector players, isn't it? People who are comfortable in private sector, public sector, and the NGO sector. And I've never worked in the private sector. It hasn't felt like my thing, but I've done a lot of work with and around people who are in the private sector, and there's extraordinary skills there. So I would say someone thinking of an NGO career would be do it.
Yeah. So we have another question that's come in. With the cuts in foreign aid by the British government, should there be a concern that the economic and social and political consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic will lead to widespread, quote, beggar thy neighbour policies by the governments around the world, with its possible negative effects on the international aid and development?
Yeah, I mean, yes, that is a danger. Beggar thy neighbor means, you know, if one country cuts, then the other country cuts, then the third country cuts, then the fourth country cuts, and then the fifth country says, yeah, but everyone else is now below us, so we've got to cut as well. So it's a sort of race to the bottom. That is a danger. Unfortunately, there wasn't a race to the top. I mean, one of the failings of the British government, including the ones I was part of, is that when we went on the path to 0.7% of our national income going on foreign aid, and just remember, 0.7, not 7 or 70% of national income, 0.7. We didn't bring other countries with us. Sweden does, Germany's on the path, but US is at 0.17. I mean, small, although it's obviously a much bigger, it's a $20 trillion economy. So it's 6 times the size of the UK economy. There is a real danger, and it's tragic. The government now saying, well, it's only for 1 year. So they're cutting £5 billion for the sake of 1 year's effort when they've just run up £350 billion of public borrowing because of COVID, and it hurts lives, and it costs influence. It's really sad, I think, really sad, because it saps the respect for the UK, which had held out even in the austerity years. It had held out for the 0.7%, and so we're a strong partner of the British government. They're a very good, they're a serious aid donor, they're a reforming aid donor, which is good, but they're now a smaller aid donor. And that's having real consequences, and real consequences that are disproportionate to the amount of money saved. And so there is a danger of beggar thy neighbor. I spoke to the European Commissioner for humanitarian aid on Tuesday, yesterday. And, you know, to be fair, the European Union is not going backwards. It's published its 7-year financial framework, and it's sticking with it on international aid, and good for them. They're also the only donor in the world to have a target that 10% of all their humanitarian aid goes on education. 50% of the people in humanitarian crisis are kids, and 3% of the humanitarian budget goes on education. And so you can see the mismatch, and so it's maddening. But to be fair to the EU, they're trying to turn that around.
That's great. Okay, we'll end on this final question that came in from Charlie Foreman. Do you miss being in UK politics, and might you ever return?
Yeah, I do miss it. I mean, it's probably, I do miss it. I don't miss everything about it, but I do miss it. I miss my colleagues and my comrades. I miss the connection to the people who vote us in or vote us out. And so I do miss it, but I try not to spend my time thinking. If you spend your time looking backwards or trying to press the rewind button, it doesn't work. And I honestly don't know what I'm going to do next. I mean, I feel very lucky to have landed where I am. I mean, as Anna was generous enough to say, the IRC's grown from being a $430 million organization 6 years ago to being will probably be a $900 million organization this year. And more important than that is the impact that we're having on people's lives. And that's very tangible. And it's not, there are 79 million people who are displaced by conflict and disaster. That's internally displaced and refugees. We think we helped probably 32, 33 million people last year in different ways, significantly in health, but also in other areas. A lot of work on gender-based violence and women's protection empowerment. We're proud to say that we won't be a successful humanitarian organization unless we're a feminist organization, which takes seriously the inequalities of power that create multiple inequalities for women and girls in the places that we work, and are sometimes reflected in the structure of the humanitarian aid sector. So I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I always say to people, I'll try and do something that is consistent with my responsibilities to my family, but also allows me to take my values and put them into practice, because as we started by saying, if you can make a difference, you should.
Wow, I think that's a lovely note to end on. Thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks for really good questions.
David, we would be very lucky to have you back into UK politics.
Oh,
it would
thank
be
you.
a very happy day indeed for everybody. So it has really been a privilege to host you. Thank you for a very important and fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Good luck with the rest of the series. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you very much. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.